I'm glad to see so many people are willing to come back tonight after having endured last week's ordeal. Before I start, I want to launch into my little commercial. Every book presently available on the History of Bethany is on the back table. Anybody who's interested in perusing or purchasing, feel free at the end. In addition, my son Robert is sitting in the back with this Southern sweatshirt, is that what it is? Who happens to be the treasurer in the Brinton family tradition, is the treasurer of the Historical Society. Will accept memberships from anybody that wants to become a member tonight. Or if you want to take home a membership form, he will have them on the back table on your way out. Quick update on the Bethany Historical Society. It's 2 weeks old. 2 weeks old tonight, is that right? 2 weeks old tonight. We have now 135 paid members as of right now. There's a tremendous amount of community enthusiasm, such as you folks have shown here tonight. We've even had donations of material items given to us. For instance, since we met last, I went over Saturday morning to Allie Wooding's old house and met her nephew, and he presented the Historical Society with all of the beautiful glass negatives from which many of the photos in the town hall, many of the photos in the back of Alice Bunton's book came from. So we now have, among other things that were donated to us on Saturday, we have 87 turn-of-the-century glass negatives. So just thought I'd update you on that. All right, tonight's subject is going to pick up where we left off. This is an almost impossible job to talk about 3 centuries of history. When you think about it, Europeans, forgetting about the Native Americans, the Europeans have occupied Bethany for the better part of 3 centuries. I mean, if there were Downses on Downs Road in 1717 and this is 1993, we're pretty close to 2000. That sure is the better part of 3 centuries. We covered 2 of them last night, and we're going to deal with the last one tonight. Tonight's talk I call Bethany, the 3rd Century. And in many ways, you're going to find that there are changes that took place in the in this present century are far more, far greater in extent than the people that lived here experienced in earlier times. And let's give you some idea of what those changes were and how the people in Bethany dealt with them. Okay, if somebody will hit the lights, and Will, if you want to get this going. The first slide that you're going to see is a photograph. Of the historical plaque that's in front of the town hall, and it just kind of is a synopsis of some of the early history of the town. If you look at the plaque, you wouldn't have had to come last week. This particularly nice photograph shows Bethany as it was right on the turn of the century. Remember at the end of last week's meeting, we had a nice picture of the 2 churches, the traditional center of the town, and I said it could have been 100 years before that. It could have been 1832 or 1800 or whatever. The same with this one. The only difference was the one that I showed you showed the very first technological changes to begin to arrive in Bethany. And that, of course, was the Davidson telephone system, as evidenced by the telephone poles that were on Amity Road. This particular one, I really haven't studied it to see if there are telephone poles, but it does show from the hillside and back of the Congregational Church. Let me get my magic pointer here. This is the Congregational Church with the original steeple on it. This is the hillside that's now covered with trees, and the Episcopal Church, and the extent of West Rock. Just amazing what you could see in those days when much more of the town was open. Many open fields. This is probably where the library is today, in this area. Remember, Amity Road had a bit of a curve to it here that was straightened out. And these are the church sheds, and we mentioned those, I believe, last week. Bethany and its hills. If there's one thing characteristic about Bethany, it's its hills. It's difficult to see when the trees are fully covered with leaves, because your horizon, when you're driving along many roads in town now, only goes as far as the few feet beyond the edge of the road, and that's all you can see. This time of the year, however, you can see through the trees, and you have a little better idea of the kind of views that people in the late 18th and throughout the 19th century had. This book by Eliza J. Lyons, which is not for sale tonight. This is fairly rare. Maybe some of you have one, I don't know. It was printed in 1905. To the best of my knowledge, this is the first book ever printed about Bethany history. You can borrow a Xerox copy of this from the library. I think the library only has one copy, and it's so fragile that we don't circulate it. It just wouldn't stand up. Looking down Hatfield Hill Road, see, even our roads have hill in them, toward Downs Road, we see how circumscribed, how narrow our vision is, almost as if we were wearing blinders. However, when we get to an area like this, we can get an idea of what probably was visible to people in the last century. This, of course, is High Rock, and the top of High Rock is presently being purchased by the state of Connecticut for inclusion in West Rock Ridge State Park, so that this area will be preserved in perpetuity, and we won't have to look at towers and things up there. This Sanford Notch is in here. West Rock is south. Bethany Gap, or Thompson's Gap, is just on the other side, and then north of that is Madmere Mountain, Bethany's Hills. And as mentioned before, Bethany was a town of fields and meadows, much more so in the turn of the century than it is today. This field on Atwater Road is an excellent example of what I think we would have seen a lot more of. Continuing with giving an idea of what life was like at the turn of the century in Bethany, this particular photograph I really enjoyed, with the old-timer in the bib overalls and the boots. He's just got through probably mucking out the barn or something, and the barefoot lads with their overalls, and they look like they're paying rapt attention to their elder. It's almost a scene that you'd see from Norman Rockwell. But this is a Hitchcock house that was on Valley Road. It's since been moved to Morris Road in Woodbridge, and doesn't look anything like this. But it's a nice scene. That's Bethany at the turn of the century. This is a scene that shows what some of the farming techniques that this could have been taken 100 years ago. This was taken by my son Will, who took all of these photographs about 2 weeks ago on Bear Hill Road. There's a coil of barbed wire on a fence post, and the old dump rake. This is what you use to rake the hay up before you forked it into the wagon. And this photograph of the property house that's still standing on Litchfield Turnpike, almost opposite Bethway Road, is just alive with people and equipment. You know, it seems like the photographer, who is, by the way, George Levi Wooding. This is one of the negatives that we got Saturday, this particular negative. The photographer must have said, okay, everybody, move all the animals and all the machinery. And I mean, it must have been kind of difficult. We have a dump cart there, and a horse-drawn mowing machine. Here's a tedder for kicking the hay up and to dry it. A wagon in the background. That would be the frame that you put on the wagon, so you could extend it out and make a much bigger load of hay. You have people with a pitchfork, rakes. This one looks like he works for the state. This is an interior picture. There's not many, we don't know what the inside of many houses look like around the turn of the century. This probably isn't a typical house. The north parlor of the Hoadley house. Parlor looks like that today. The furniture, of course, isn't there. But the furniture would have been something that somebody around the turn of the century might have in their homes. Moving back outside and getting a little bit away from buildings, but still with a built environment, still with the things that man has done. One thing that any of you who own land in Bethany know is you probably see stone walls, and you wonder, what are those stone walls doing in the woods? Well, when those stone walls were built, they certainly weren't in the woods. They were dividing up fields, meadows, pastures. This is a good example. This was taken on just off Amity Road, across from the Congregational Church. It shows you how they took a row of face stones on each side and then put a rubble infill. And when was this built? We don't know. It certainly is 150 years old, maybe 200 years old, but it doesn't look much the worse for wear. What I'm trying to get at here is that most of this work, the clearing of the land, the pulling of the stumps, the building of the stone walls after clearing the fields of rocks, was done by the turn of the century. This is an unusual stone wall on Litchfield Turnpike. You don't find many stone walls with a date on it, but at the northern end of this stone wall that stood on the former Davidson farm, the builder was so proud of his work, he dated it 1877.
Where is that? You live here. You're the one that talked to you. Where is that?
This is on Litchfield Turnpike, almost opposite the intersection with Hoadley Road.
Okay.
There's a small, I'm trying to think of who lives in the house there.
McDonald.
Yeah, okay, but it's just south of that.
Sullivan.
Sullivan. I think this is just south of the Sullivan's house. I don't want anybody walking off with us. I know who you people are. After the turn of the century, changes started to take place. People started to come out to the country more. Bethany's population had dwindled, not only because parts of Bethany were broken away to create Naugatuck. A large chunk of Bethany was broken away to create, remember, Beacon Falls. But also because no longer was Bethany a good place to make a living in a farm. Maybe it never was, but evidently there were better places. People could move west, or people could go to the city and get manufacturing jobs that might not be so hard, or might be more lucrative, or at least might have more variety. So Bethany lost population. Its lowest ebb, as I remember, was 1920 with 411 people in town. Pretty small town with many vacant buildings. If you think New Haven has vacant buildings, Bethany had numerous vacant homes. Some of them in ruins. Many of them were torn down or burned down or fell down. But whenever you have a vacuum, something always comes in to occupy it. People started coming out because of the technological changes that were taking place, this being the bicycle. And people came out, much as they do today on Downs Road. You ever been on Downs Road on a Saturday to see the bicycles that come out there? It's amazing. But here we are 100 years before. This is Everett's Temperance Drinks. This is called the Wheelman's Rest. And it's kind of a nice photograph. This stood at the northwest corner of Bethway Road and Litchfield Turnpike. As a youngster, the foundation is still there. Many of the roads in Bethany probably look something like this in the best times of the year. This is a picturesque section of Myers Road. Roads were kept in condition by originally bought with horse-drawn scrapers. This is the earliest road tool there was, where you'd have someone with a team and man in back. This is Downs Road, and trying to think what year it is. But it says on the back of the photograph it's Downs Road. And I believe that Ellie Downs has one team. Perhaps his father is Scraper. I showed this, by the way, you're the second to see this. I showed this to the senior citizens yesterday, and Henry Riley was in attendance, and he remembers working on a road scraper similar to this. And he said he always operated the third team. And I said, well, what was the third team for? He said, well, when you came to a hill, you had to add another team to get it up the hill. On the level, you could get by with the two teams, these two pairs of horses. And you ended up with an elegant road like this. This particular photograph was taken about 1918. Not on a little road like Atwater Road or Sanford Road or something like that. This is the Litchfield Turnpike. One of the two best roads in town. As a matter of fact, in the early 19th century, it was the best road in town. Way better than Amity Road. Because, remember, it was a toll road. And it had income coming in to support it. I know exactly where this is. This is a few hundred feet south of the Bethany town line on a section of the Litchfield Turnpike that now has been abandoned. What are we getting at here? Well, travel was pretty tough on gravel, on dirt roads. This isn't even gravel. In the summer they were dusty. In the winter they were best because then you could go sleighing and they were smooth, no friction, it's quiet. Except if you ever read about sleighing, it really wasn't all that great because it seems like the sleighs must have just been tipping over all the time. I read one time an account of somebody coming from Wallingford, and they listed the number of times they had to get up and set the sleigh upright. It doesn't sound like fun. But at this time, if you wanted to get to the new technology, the automobile, and this flipper in this case, it just didn't work in this kind of a road. Old Dobbin could just about make it. Old Dobbin could walk around and into the woods if he had to. But I think you can see the problem here with roads. And there was a big push in the teens to improve roads, to pave them. I think the Grange was very, which was a kind of a more political organization in those days, was instrumental in getting Connecticut out of the mud. And we began to get people coming out to the country. And it's sort of like today, when you build a new bridge, like the Quinnipiac Bridge, and now you can handle more people, but now more people move to the east and use the bridge, and now it becomes inadequate, you've got to build another one. This is kind of what happened with the roads and the automobile. The better the roads, the more people that came out. The more people that came out, the more call there was for improving roads. This is, as I said, Litchfield Turnpike. I know this was taken in 1918 because this was taken by Clifford Whitlock, who was one of the people that was anxious to get the roads improved because in 1918 or 1917 he moved out to Bethany and was trying to commute to Broadway in New Haven to his store. And it's not easy over roads like that. More cars came out. This happens to be the Hoagley House. This is Amity Road. This is what Amity Road looked like before 1910. It's just a narrow dirt road. I happen to have a collection of photographs that I found dealing with the Hoagley House. Most of them have old cars in front of them because people started coming out and they started taking photographs. They took photographs of their cars. They took photographs of the places they saw, and in general, they were just kind of interested in this new mobility that the automobile offered them. Amity Road was the first road in Bethany to be paved, and I've read alternatively 1918 and 1915. I really don't know how to document it. I haven't tried, but I think we can say that this was improved in the teens from this kind of a condition to at least putting a hard surface on it. The Litchfield Turnpike was not improved until somewhat later. Incidentally, I don't know if you know this, but the Litchfield Turnpike had, according to Tyler Davidson, had regular stagecoach service until 1907. The last, I know we think about stagecoaches being in the Old West and the Western films. There was regular stagecoach service between New Haven and Waterbury until 1907. 10 years later, we have people coming out in cars. I mean, it's just an absolutely tremendous revolution of transportation. Because of the cars, the roads were no longer serviceable. Simply putting a hard surface on Amity Road was not enough. So in 1931, the state took over the improvement of the road. And this shows a real steam shovel, real smoke, real burnt coal, digging into the hill, going north to the summit where the two churches are located. This, of course, again, is a congregational church with the original steeple before it blew off in a hurricane. And incidentally, that was moved back in order to accommodate the newly widened road. With the automobile came the need for services associated with the automobile. This is, if not the earliest, this is certainly one of the earliest garages and automobile dealerships in Bethany. And this is the Elm Shade Garage, still standing. This was taken a couple of weeks ago. And this was owned by the Doolittles. Originally they sold Model T Fords here. Later on Plymouths, and when I was a youngster, they were selling Hudsons. I know how to pick a winner, huh? Okay, we're going to step back in time and see what this looked like in the old days. Not a great picture. An old touring car turned into a wrecker. I particularly like the gas prices in those days. When I came across this photo a number of years ago, for those of you who remember when Art Rawson owned the property and used it for storage of his tree surgery trucks and equipment, I thought he'd be interested in seeing it. Because I just thought it was kind of a great photo. So I showed it to him, thinking that he'd say, gee, what a neat car. And he said, there's the elm tree, which I hadn't even seen. But sure, there's the elm tree, and this bench says Elm Shade Garage. Another thing that happened, and some of you maybe haven't been around quite so long, don't realize it, with the automobile came something new. Remember I said we had kind of a vacuum here. We had empty houses, empty land, people were more mobile. We had a lot of summer cottages in Bethany. I only show you one, but there were many, many, many summer cottages. I think in the 1930 directory of Bethany, which lists real estate, I think about 12 or 15% of the real estate in Bethany was owned by non-residents. Much of that, I would think, would be summer people. Downs Road, where this is located, had more than its share of summer cottages, and this was one. Judge Barnett later on added a second floor here, but the porch and the main part of the house are as they were in the 20s and 30s. Okay, moving along from the concept of transportation, I want to get into some of the public services that we enjoy today and how they came about. Many of these came about through volunteer work on the part of inhabitants of the town and through private organizations and associations dedicated to the improvement of their community. And we still have a great deal of this in Bethany, and I think this is part of what makes Bethany a wonderful place. This is Perry's Hall. It stood south of the Child's House, almost across from the Congregational Church. And between 1875 and 1914, this was the main place for people to meet. Town meetings were held here, elections were held here, among other things. Before that, very often, town meetings were held in people's homes. It'd have to be a home with a large room, like the Hoadley House that had a ballroom, or the Toll's house on Sperry Road that had a ballroom. But generally, this is where the meetings were held. I kind of like this photo. It came out better than it really had any right to, because it came from a book. But the part that's interesting is that it shows the old benches, which later on were put into the town hall, and a few of them are still around. We have one in the old schoolhouse, and I know there's a number around town still. I never realized that they went back to maybe 1875. This is the Perry's Hall today. I want to get out there and tape it before somebody takes the stones and we lose track of what size it was. Bethany's first town hall, remember we've only had two, the present one and this was built in 1914. It's the only building that was built by the town expressly for the purpose of accommodating town meetings. Every other building was for another purpose. Even the town hall we have now is a recycled school. Incidentally, no one can answer the question for me. I'm assuming that inside this cornerstone is probably a box with some documents, and I don't have a clue, number one, if it's there, and number two, what's in it. If anybody has ever run across anything that told about it, maybe a newspaper article. Sometimes when a newspaper article covering the dedication might tell something about it, we might be able to find out. It's an interesting thing. The only other one I know about in town is I know the library cornerstone has a little time capsule in a little lead box. This is from a 1930 town report, but it does show the town hall as it used to look before the present. The old town hall before it had the present asbestos siding was applied. Town hall was used for a number of functions. I have a lot of photographs of the inside of it. This is one of my favorites because and some of you have been around for a while will pick out some of the people that are still around in town. This is Henry Riley, for instance, Arlene Burley. This was in the late 40s. A number of productions of all kinds were put on here, including several Gilbert and Sullivan productions. This is, of course, the Pirates of Penzance, and my first grade teacher, Mrs. Doolittle, is Little Buttercup. In addition to plays and town meetings, the town hall was used by the selectmen for their meetings. The courtroom, or anteroom in the front of it. Those of you that have been around a while would remember that we did used to have our own town court. As recently as 1952, my father was prosecutor, and beyond 1952, but in 1952, the town courtroom was still heated with a wood stove. So my father, in the wintertime, would always go early and light a fire in the wood stove to heat up the courtroom before the proceedings. One of the things I think you're going to be getting if you're fairly newcomer is the fact that Bethany tends to move a little slow. We're a little conservative, and we don't make changes quickly. We don't want to be the first to try out things like electricity and stuff like that. The town hall, by the way, didn't get electricity until 1927. I think they paid $300 or something like that to have it wired. Before that, the town hall had simply kerosene lamps. I'll go one step further. Until 1952, the town hall did not have running water. Instead, it had two privies in back. And the only running water was if a youngster like myself went out and pumped water into a bucket and ran into the kitchen with it to keep the ladies who were making supper supplied with water. That was the closest we came to running water. This little barn that stood until fairly recently is on the Hinman property on Amity Road, south of the churches, just north of the firehouse, which is considerably more horizontal today than you see it here. Was a site downstairs of the Hinman print shop, an interesting story in itself. And upstairs is the town clerk's office. It was customary in in Connecticut in small towns for the town clerk to keep the town records in his home. This did not cease in Bethany until 1952. We didn't have a vault to keep our records in. All of the town records and deeds were kept upstairs in that little barn, heated by a wood stove. You can see the chimney there. I remember hearing the subsequent town clerk, Sid Swirsky, describe taking over as town clerk and continuing to utilize this as the town clerk's office for the town of Bethany. And when people came up to register deeds, mortgages, attachments in the wintertime, these had to be recorded in indelible ink. In those days would be with a sax pen, you remember those? And in the wintertime, the attorneys who would come up from New Haven and Fairfield County or wherever they came from would have to sit around and wait until the wood stove did its work and thawed out the ink before the records could be dated and recorded. Just a quick peek downstairs. I have a whole series of photographs, but just a peek downstairs at the old Hinman print shop, where virtually everything that was printed in Bethany was printed in here between the early days, probably, I'm trying to think when he moved down here, but he did printing for almost everybody in town from about 1900 to 1946. There's your wood stove. I think one of his, after this, George Vail bought the equipment. I think one of the presses was dated 1850 something. The very early equipment. John Hinman himself, who started in Beacon Falls as a printer before the turn of the century, had bought most of this equipment used. Okay, we're going to get back into transportation, but a little loftier type, and we're going to be talking about aviation a bit. Why are we looking at this Isaac Sperry House as it looks today on Litchfield Turnpike? Well, this was the home of Julius Doolittle. And sometime around the turn of the century, Julius Doolittle got very, very interested in aeronautics, as we call it today. And he decided that he would make some experiments. And one of his experiments included making a gigantic glider. Today, well, I guess we'd call it a hang glider. And he tried to take off from the barn roof with his hang glider with less than complete success. As a matter of fact, he broke his leg. And Julius Doolittle was ever afterwards known as Flying Machine Doolittle. I don't know how many of you have heard of Flying Machine Doolittle, but he's one of our local heroes. I think his son was Woodchuck Doolittle, and he's another story. Okay, we had an ideal place in Bethany for the location of an airport. Tyler Davidson records in his journal that in 1918, July 4th, 1918, I believe 5 aeroplanes passed over the town of Bethany, the first that had ever been sighted. In 1920, he records the first plane landed in Bethany 1 mile north of the center. Well, we know where that is. That's Lebanon Hill, where our present, where the later airport was to be established. He also wrote that there's talk of setting up an airfield, and indeed there was, and 3 years later, Bethany Airport opened. Reputedly one of the oldest commercial airports in the state of Connecticut. Whether it's the oldest or not, I don't know. But one of the hangars, one of the ones between that and the one we have now, used to say on the south end of it, oldest airport in the world. This is probably, and this is a whole study that needs to be done, this is probably the second hangar, pretty much in the location of the present one. And was probably taken in the 30s. First one was built in the 20s, this one was built in the 30s, and unfortunately burned in 1942. to be replaced by a wooden one, and then subsequently replaced by the Quonset hut style structure that we have now. I just kind of like this aerial photograph because we don't have many early aerial photographs, and this was a high quality one. There's a little damage to the negative, but it was taken sometime probably in the late 30s. We can learn certain things by looking at it. We know that, although it doesn't show on this particular slide, we can see on the original that the state police barracks is there. We can see that this is obviously this is Amity Road. It's a concrete road. It's the white road. Litchfield Turnpike was the black road. This is Munson Road here. This is the ball field. This was the site of Lebanon Road, but it has been removed, and that was done in 1936. You can still see the phantom outline of the road here. New Fairwood Road, which started here and skirts around the airport and comes out here opposite the Humane Society, is visible. It's amazing how close the airport came to New Fairwood Road. Not too many years ago, you could see there were field delineators, boards, that marked the edge of the field, and you could actually see them from Fairwood Road. Since then, so many trees have grown up, even if the delineators were there, you couldn't see them. You can see there are old fields here that are beginning to grow up to cedars. I've been told the date that this stone wall came out. You can see that that would definitely be provide an impediment to planes taking off, and we can see why they discovered that that stone wall would be a good thing to remove. Bethany purchased the airport property for an industrial area. Well, some industry went in there. We did sell off a few pieces of land. Some of it was developed, but today, judging by the outcome of the preliminary report of the Airport Study Committee, it sounds like we really think of this as our park, our fairgrounds, our event field, and I really doubt that we're going to be selling any further land in this area. Yes?
I read in the newspaper about 4 or 5 years ago that American Airlines started at Bethany Airport. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, I've heard that. I really have not researched it yet. I have a whole file home that needs to be put together, and there are all kinds of interesting stories to do with the airport. Easily do a whole evening just on the airport. Okay. There is a wealth of information, and a lot more to be garnered as well. This is how we're presently using the old hangar. When the airport became available, we purchased first of all the hangar, because we knew we were just organizing at that time a highway department, and we thought, well, gee, this is a good place to put the trucks temporarily until we build a highway garage. But as I said, in Bethany, we're a little conservative sometimes, and it takes us a while, but we're working on it. I think the garage is going to be coming in the next couple of years, because the old hangar is, first of all, really wasn't designed for that purpose, and it's in deplorable condition. I just kind of had to throw this in. This is so typical of this area of Bethany. It's so prone to fogs. Not a very good day to take off for a landing. Okay, moving along to town events. There were several events that really captured people's imaginations, that brought them together, made them aware of their common heritage, their identification with historical figures. One was the centennial. Remember, we were incorporated in 1832. The centennial in 1932 was a really big event, and we could do a whole night on that. There is, by the way, if anybody's interested, a video that was made of a 16mm film that the library owns of the parade, 1932 parade. It's kind of fun. You can just go to the library, take it out. It doesn't cost anything. Incidentally, the last meeting last week and this meeting are going to be in the library probably in about a week. If anybody wants to borrow them, they'll just be here. Those ribbons, those official ribbons, there are so many of them around. You wonder, in a small town like Bethany, was there anybody that wasn't an official? Was anybody left to watch the parade? This is the parade traveling south on Amity Road, same way most of our parades go today. This is, of course, the Episcopal Rectory and the Episcopal Church is barely visible through the trees. All of these photographs of the parade are kind of interesting because we remember that in those days, everyone wore hats. All men wore, you never saw a man without a hat. Schools, we're going to just briefly go through schools to give you an idea of what we did in education. Because what we did in education, as with some other areas, was just absolutely revolutionary. We had one-room schoolhouses in Bethany until 1934. 8 grades, 1 teacher, 1 room. Some of these schoolhouses were small. You'll see in a moment. This is a drawing, I just kind of like it. The Center School originally stood where the present Center Firehouse is now. It was moved back from the road in 1931 when Amity Road is widened. In 1934, when the present Town Hall was built as a community school, big change. We had 4 one-room schoolhouses at that time operating, and we built 1 4-room schoolhouse. Same number of students, same number of teachers, but we got them all under one roof from them. In 1934, this was, as you're going to see in a moment, turned into a firehouse. Then it was moved up to the ball field and used as an athletic clubhouse, and then later moved back to its present location where it was restored our new North Campus of the community school. Other schools in town were this one on Downs Road. Incidentally, every one of these schoolhouses is still standing, but except for Center School that you just saw, everyone has been made into a residence. This one on Downs Road, as I said, this is the smallest schoolhouse in town. This is the Smith School, and it stood, it still stands, I guess, made into a house, on Carrington Road on the west side, just north of Porter Hill Road. Gate School, located on the Litchfield Turnpike, near the intersection of what we call today Route 42, very near the Doolittle Garage. My first grade teacher, Mrs. Doolittle, Albina Doolittle, taught in this school. Where did it get its name from? Well, that was where the toll gate was. Remember we talked about the toll gate on the Litchfield Turnpike? So, this is Gate School, because it was next to the toll gate. Beecher Road School is the one with all the windows. If you ever see this, this has been moved across the road, made into a house. Looks like they're getting prepared for winter. Getting the fuel ready. Particularly like this. This is another one of the photographs taken by George Levi Wooding about 1900. That this is one of the negatives, glass negatives that we just acquired. And this is titled Beecher Road School with Scholars. We also had one without the children. That's called Beecher Road School without scholars. Early school bus. This actually was a Bethany school bus. Our children got to school if they couldn't walk, when distances were too great. 1 horsepower. It's an early picture, actually didn't come out too well, but an early photograph of the community school that was built in 1934. And this was, the times were hard in 1934. I believe we got some sort of a WPA grant to do this. And of course, this is the this is the core of our present town hall. And this, of course, is looking from the east. We're more used to coming into the driveway on the other side and entering the west side. And for the west side, there's a wing on this side. You can't see it. There's a matching wing on that side. But on the west side of the building, it shows a smooth front. There's no job. This was found in cleaning up the coal bin of the town hall about a month ago. This was found under some debris, and it means something to me because I was in school then, and field day was a big thing in those days. We took the whole school, 8 grades, maybe 100 kids, and we divided them in half, and we had all kinds of contests and races and athletic competitions, tug of wars, things like that. We spent the whole day outside. It was pretty exciting for a youngster in a small town. And this is our North Campus, built in 1970. It was finished in 1970. I want to stop here just for a minute and recapitulate what we did with schools before we go on. Because a lot of people think that we put a lot of emphasis on schools. We think that, which is true, we do, but few people realize that a generation ago, people put a lot more of themselves into the school in terms of what it cost us. For instance, in the previous photograph, you saw the 4-room schoolhouse. That lasted until 1948, when we had to add a couple of rooms on. As a matter of fact, the post-war baby boom hit us so fast, we had no place to put the children. So we had to hold classes in the police barracks for, I was either 1 or 2 years, until we were able to start building. And we started building. We went from 4 rooms. In 1948, we built 2 more. In 1953, we built 2 more. In 1956, we built a 4-room unit. In 1961, we built another 4-room unit. In 1965, I believe, we built a 6-room unit. And then in 1970, we built this, which has, I think, 14 rooms. Okay, you want to count up those rooms? I think this is 32 rooms we built between 1948 and 1970. 22 years, we built 32 rooms. Okay, now, how many rooms have we built in the last 22 years? 0. We haven't built any. Matter of fact, we closed down the old part of the school and we took out 8 rooms. So it's something to think about. This is our junior high school. Serves the Amity region, but it's in Bethany, and obviously we have use of it. I couldn't leave it out because we're right here. Okay, we're going to get on to another service. We're through with education, and you probably can't guess what service this is by looking at this slide, but it has a good story that goes with it. This is one that was given to me by John Early, and this is their home. It burned in 1920 on Bear Hill Road. Well, why is this here? Well, it's an interesting story that goes with it. Just in back of the original farmhouse, there's a little barn. It was only 3 or 4 feet away from the house, very close. And the barn caught fire in 1920. And there was no water, they had no telephone, there was no fire department in Bethany. They sent someone by horse or car, I don't know. They sent someone to find a phone and call the Seymour Fire Department. Long story. And they proceeded to do what they could do. They took every bit of furniture out of the house. Show you the amount of time they had. They took the doors and windows out of the house. They had enough time. They couldn't stop the fire. They couldn't put the fire out the barn, and they couldn't keep it from spreading to the house. But they could take all the doors and windows out. And today, the replacement house uses these doors and windows. Hard for us to imagine, with the fire service we have today, that people in the old days were practically helpless when it came to fire. The book I showed you that was written in 1905 by Eliza J. Lyons, the subtitle says Bethany and its Hills, and it's underneath it, it says, "Before the fire fiend robbed it of its glory." So many houses burned in the old days. Interesting story in Tyler Davidson's journal. He tells about the Edmund Peck house, which was just up the road from him, catching fire, waking up at 2 in the morning. He had a telephone, remember, because he and He's the one that developed the Davidson telephone system. He called the neighbors. Soon they had 30 neighbors there. Couldn't do much. He saved one youngster. The Edmund Peck burned to death, as did his daughter Mary. As he left the house, he took 2 fire grenades with him. Now, for those of you who don't know, a fire grenade was a little glass ball, a little bigger than a light bulb. And you hang it up, and it had carbon tetrachloride. And if there was a fire, you threw it at the fire, and maybe the fire went out if it was only in a wastebasket or something. It usually had a fusible link on it. It would fall down when the temperature got up so high. Probably by the time the fire got through the roof, it would fall down and probably would do it. So he said on the way out, he took these 2 fire grenades. He arrived at this house. It was a large house. It used to be a tavern, the Smith Tavern. And he stood there. And fire was coming out the windows. Fire was coming out of the roof. And all he had was these 2 little fire grenades. And he didn't know what to do. So he threw them at the fire. And I guess he probably would have felt foolish if he brought it back home, but he felt equally foolish throwing them at a fully involved fire.
Having find them today, but don't you?
No, they produce a deadly phosgene gas. If we're going to have World War I over again, they might come in handy. But no, you don't want them. They're not good stuff. We used to have them in the town hall, hanging up all around the building. This is Bethany Firehouse, our very first firehouse. The fire department was organized in 1934. And what they did was they simply took the schoolhouse and put a door in one end, and they drove their fire engine in. The first fire engine was either 24 or 26 Seagrave. And soon after, maybe the next year, they got a 1935 Ford. Now, what do? We got a firehouse with 1 door. Now we have 2 fire engines. Mr. Johnson probably remembers that what you did is you paint a line down the middle of the floor, and you put one engine in, and then you kind of get the other one next to it. And believe me, there were only inches to spare. And I think Mr. Johnson can corroborate the story that on more than one occasion, a hasty driver managed to take the doors off, right off the hinges. But that was our first firehouse. Remember, this building was built in 1834. We used it for 100 years for a schoolhouse, and now we've recycled it for a firehouse. And this wasn't replaced until, well, actually 1953. I believe the existing firehouse was completed. Again, dealing with the fire service, I kind of like this map, and I don't know if anybody besides Mr. Johnson here is a fireman, but this is the old fire zone map of Bethany. Somewhere, I think it was around 1939, because I remember reading an article in the clipping from a paper. Bethany obtained a whistle for the first time. Before that, all we had was a telephone tree, where somebody calls somebody and they call 4 people, and each of those called 4 people. But we got modern, and we were given, I believe, I don't know what town it came from, an excellent whistle. Probably, it's an antique. Actually, the equipment is still in the firehouse. But it was a used piece of equipment, something like our first fire truck. And it had little brass discs that you put on, started the mechanism, and as a little indicator went up and down through little jogs on the edge of the disc, that activated the whistle. The only problem was that when we inherited this, we only inherited a handful of these little discs, and they were pre-programmed for a particular number of blasts of the whistle. And for that reason, we had to use the numbers that were available to us. See, you notice there's no rhyme or reason to these districts. For instance, if you were here, you were in District 12, 13, 14, 15. Well, that's not too bad. But here's 21, 23, 213, and so forth. I remember we were in 131, and I'd always listen for 1 blast, then 3 blasts, and then you'd get a single blast, and then you'd look for smoke. That would give you a general idea of the location of the fire. This is long before they had pagers or beepers or 2-way radios or anything like that.
Did didn't know where to find a way to put the right color.
And this is the plaque commemorating. Well, I guess it was. I thought it was early 1953, late 1953, that the new firehouse that was built by the firemen was dedicated. And I kind of like this picture, which was taken by Bill Ringenberg, and he took this in 1953, so it must have been pretty new at that time. This was the first new truck that we ever bought. This is, I believe, 1950 Ford, presently located at the second firehouse that was built in Bethany, the Hindman Station. Incidentally, both the Center Station and the Hindman Station were added on to subsequent to their building. That's always flying out the Hindman Station. Okay, library services. Another similar service run by a volunteer organization who provides necessary services for the town. Bethany Library Association was formed just a couple years before the fire department, 1930, and it was located, I don't have a slide for it, but it was located in a small cottage on Treat B. Johnson's property on Amity Road, just south of Valley. In 1936, we were given a gift, a Noyes Clark, that enabled us to build this handsome building at no cost to the town. This particular photograph was taken in 1940, and it shows the library as we know it today. Interestingly enough, many people didn't like the idea that a lot of trees were recently cut around the library, but if you note here, the library looks today much more like it did in 1936 than it did a few months ago. Our lease service was provided until fairly recent years at no cost to the town by the state of Connecticut, because we were lucky enough to have a police barracks located here in 1939. I throw this in here because we're just kind of winding up the 1930s, and we're winding up some of the changes that took place in the town before World War II. Kind of dealing with this interwar period. And this is Bethany's first subdivision. To the best of my knowledge, Bethany's only pre-World War II subdivision, and that's Bethany Wood, now called Woods Road. And it was set up so that there would be a great deal of cooperation between the property owners. The property owners were supposed to have like values and to share responsibilities for things like maintaining the road, so the cost of maintaining the road. Up until recent years, they all shared a common well and took turns maintaining it, checking it, and so forth. It was sort of an early experiment in suburban developments. Peck Pond was purchased by the town and the Athletic Association. And I believe the Athletic Association was formed, I'm trying to think of the exact date, it was in the 30s, probably around 34. The Athletic Association first leased this land from Nels Peck, and you're all familiar with this, where this is, from 48 to 1950. In 1950, it was taken over by both the association and the town jointly, although the association at first did most of the work and most of the management. The association also, for many years, leased the ball field at the corner of Munson Road and Amity Road, or near Amity Road, from Harris Whittemore, and it was leased at $1 a year. And the members of the ball club or the athletic association put in their own labor and their own money to gradually improve and upgrade the field. Eventually, they were able to purchase the field. The town now owns it, as well as a nearby parking lot. But the building was built by the Athletic Association, not the town of Bethany. Here's another association that's providing services to the town on a voluntary basis at little or no cost to the town. we haven't said anything about World War I, and unfortunately not much has been done with World War I in Bethany. There was a plaque in the old town hall, I don't know where it's gone, that listed the World War I veterans. But World War II was something else again. World War II brought out a lot of patriotic feeling, a lot of citizen involvement, not only through cooperation with government programs, rationing, civil defense and things like that, but a great deal of recognition for the men who were in service. This honor roll was built shortly after the beginning of the war. I don't know how they determined how large it was going to be and how many slots they had to use, but whenever anyone went into the service, they had, this is all made out of wood, they had a title made up, a board made up with their name and inserted it. And this was probably taken somewhere in the probably early to mid 40s. Might have been 43. This was taken by O.D. Crooker. But you remember Chief Crooker? He was quite an amateur photographer. Those are his drawings. He took this photograph and made up copies, and every serviceman on here got one. And there are many of these still treasured in the town today. At the end of the war, I really don't know the story of this, but at the end of the war, I ran across this photograph of the interior of the town hall. This reception was held, and this is the kind of research we need to do. We need to get somebody to identify these people. I mean, I can identify some people like Teddy Sizer, Frank Zyka, kind of stands head and shoulders, and we're going to see there might be Harris Hoppy there. I can't tell. Probably hard for you too, but if you look at the original photograph, you'd see a lot of the Bethany boys here, just when they returned from the service. And after the second, well, these are ones that didn't return. This is in the town hall. After the war, we started to plan for the future. And I don't know if anybody's ever seen this before. I found this among my parents' materials. It's dated May 6th, 1946, Post-War Planning Commission, and it's just amazing to read it because it's very much ahead of its time. It recommends many of the things that took us 20 or 30 years to do, and we've done them. It took us a long time, but in my opinion, or at least as far as I've been able to determine, this is the first printed material I've seen where the people in the town of Bethany have actively tried to sit down and say, what direction do we want our town to go in? Now this particular one describes such thing. The first thing was to help veterans to settle, and you know, which is a short-term goal. But most of the goals here are, you're going to find long-term goals. Housing was an issue in those days. We had men coming home from service, starting families, the beginning of the baby boom. We needed places for them to live, and in the 40s we had our what's now called Bethany Mobile Home Park established on Litchfield Turnpike. Well, now it's Andrew Road. This is what it looks like today. That's our only mobile home park. Okay, on the lighter side, I don't know how many of you remember this, but this was, I guess this would be DEP's nightmare today, but for a youngster, this was a big thing. Every 4th of July, there was a carnival held jointly by the Athletic Association and the Fire Department, two service organizations in town, and they were fantastically successful. They sold fireworks in the early days before they were outlawed, and they had fireworks displays which were costly, but the men built these bonfires. They were made out of whatever you could find. Timbers, probably timbers from an old barn. Many packing cases. At one time we used to build them out of wire cases from Acme wire. And they were really something. There's even a couple of wagon wheels here. Anything you could get that would burn. And we used to get people for miles around. This was the only bonfire in the area. And at around midnight, this would be lit, and people would just stand for an hour and watch this thing burn. It's hard to believe now. People don't get onto incinerators and watch them. I see my idea, but there's no magic. But standing around at midnight on the dewy ground, looking at this burning was evidently entertaining enough to bring people from other towns and miles around. Can't talk about the 1950s without talking about the Amity Star. Still the best local paper that this area has ever seen. I'm sure the people that put out the Woodbridge Bethany Bulletin wouldn't like to hear me say that, but it's true. It's put out by George Vail, who was a tremendous wit. He included articles of substance. He had thoughtful editorials. He had interesting historical pieces, advertising as well, but it was quite a paper. And you notice there's nothing, Woodbridge Bethany Bulletin. Bethany comes first. Look at the left-hand column. Bethany comes first. And here's contractors. Construction work begun at Bethany's new firehouse. May 3rd, 1951. This was in print for, let's see, 51, 52, and part of 53. And then he went out of business. I threw this in here because I think at the last meeting I made mention of Downs Road, and we showed you a mill there, and I said I was kind of cheating because it's the sawmill on Downs Road really was in operation well into this century. As a matter of fact, up until the 1950s. And a couple of weeks ago, I went through the mill. The owner let me go through, and I located this old hanging sign. That's me modeling it. And that's a sign that stood out by Downs Road in the 1950s, showing that they were still producing lumber by water power in Bethany in the 1950s. And I think I remember I mentioned that electricity didn't reach this area until 1947. And that mill was still producing electric power for a single house until 1947. Okay, Bethany Lost and Bethany Preserved. This is the Bethany Lost part. This is the handsome Methodist church that originally stood right in front of the Methodist Cemetery on Litchfield Turnpike, just north of Hatfield Hill Road. And I say handsome church because it has clean, classic, simple lines. Nothing ostentatious about this church. I think a Quaker or a Shaker couldn't even want anything much simpler than this. That's what's left of it today, just the first step. And of course that commemorative marker telling what was there. Okay, that was Bethany Lost. This is Bethany Preserved. The old 1934 schoolhouse that had served as a firehouse is being recycled here as a bicentennial project. 1976. 1976, the country got caught up in the wave of enthusiasm for preserving history, the history of the country, which is 200 years old. And as a project, Bethany decided that they would take this kind of derelict building, which had been used for a number of years as a clubhouse up on Munson Road, move it back down Amity Road and to the school property where it was restored. Next, a few years later, soon after all of our celebrations of the bicentennial of the United States, we celebrated here in Bethany the sesquicentennial of the town of Bethany, 1832 to 1982. And as part of that, we for the first time got our logo designed by Betsy Seaton, which you find on town stationery and any official town business. Kind of shows the center of town with the two churches. Okay, moving up in time, the old school Center Schoolhouse is recycled into a town hall by the addition of the vault and a few other things. Dedicated to memory of Gordon Carrington. Okay, we're going to kind of briefly update you here. We're now up to the 1980s, and I throw this in here. This is our monument to empty stores. The 1970s seemed to be more interested in history, but now we're into commerce. The 1990s, this is our monument to unsold building lots. Actually, a very beautiful meadow that's been subdivided on the intersection of Bear Hill and Miller Road. But we wanted to give you an idea of what's like now before the development, and you can see how the development is going to go. All right, we're going to be kind of concluding with a few photographs showing Bethany today. Some of the parts, the old features of Bethany, they're still here, that kind of rural feeling that we can still find if we look hard enough. And actually, we don't have to look too hard. This is only a short distance from Amity Road on Myers Road. This is where the pavement ends and the gravel begins. Elsie Holter's farm. I just love the sign. The early farm. I'm showing these because there are 2 remaining dairy farms. We had to show Bossy here. And this is how we conclude. I guess that's John Early and myself walking off into the sunset. The cows are kind of a nice touch. The subdivision's kind of an ominous touch, but it's kind of a pretty shot. And that's it. You're excused. You're a fine audience.